Well, welcome to this meeting of the Progressive Christian Network of Victoria. As we begin, let us acknowledge wherever it is that we are at the moment, either here at the Ewing Centre in Burke Road, East Malvern, or sitting in front of your screen at on Zoom. Wherever we are on the country of the First Nations. Here we're on the land of the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we recognise their elders and ancestors with respect. A couple of things for the virtual audience that will make your experience better. Please keep your microphone on mute, and for the best viewing picture, select speaker view. If you do select speaker view, you will see the speaker very clearly and close up. If you choose gallery view, you'll see the backs of people's heads and the speaker in the far distance, and I'm sure you don't want to do that. So put your screen on speaker view. It's my great pleasure to welcome back to us the Reverend Dr. Sally Douglas, who has spoken to us before a couple of years ago. Totally different subject to the one in which she's going to talk to us today. But Sally has had a distinguished career as an academic, and still, I think, does teach at Pilgrim College as an adjunct professor or something close to that. And she also writes books, and she's written this slimish volume, which packs a lot of weight into its pages, The Church as Salt, Becoming the Community Jesus Speaks About. She will explain exactly what all that means, but obviously it's drawing on a metaphor that's widely used throughout the New Testament and elsewhere in the Bible. As a metaphor for humanity, basically. It comes from that. So very welcome, Sally, and we look forward to your address. Incidentally, have some sympathy for Sally. She's just recovered from a nasty bout of COVID. She'll speak for about 30 minutes. And then what we will do is we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll give the Zoom audience some instructions as to how that is to be done. So welcome, Sally. I'm very glad you're here and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to be with you all, and I look forward to your questions and our ongoing conversation. Invite us just to take a moment to arrive. Might want to lower your shoulders. I don't know about you, but sometimes when people say to take a deep breath, you realise your shoulders are at your ears. So just let yourself take a breath and arrive, and feel free if you want to make notes of the questions you would like to ask later, or the conversation that you'd like to have. So this book wasn't what I had been planning to write next, but I wrote an article for Crossline, and publishers approached me and asked me to write some more about this. And so that was the beginning of this book. I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of the kind of foundational argument, because it's quite pertinent in our culture right now. I'm not sure if you've ever heard this phrase, maybe you haven't. The church is dying. Have you heard that one? Has that ever come across your radar? It's repeated like a mantra everywhere you go, within the church, in the media as well. And I actually don't think that's what's happening right now. I think something more challenging and also more interesting is happening. And that's really the premise of this book, or the beginning anyway. So I'd like to invite us into that context. My own research is across biblical studies and theology, with a particular focus on the early church up to about 250. But then from those sources, asking, well, what does this mean for us? So this kind of interplay between early church texts, biblical texts, and us now. So you'll see that in our little dive in today. To situate ourselves in our current context, I think is really important, particularly for people who are old enough to remember the Sunday schools when they were full, and the tennis courts that were booked, and the social dances that were happening if you were Presbyterian. That whole milieu in which the church was at the centre of society. Not everyone went, but there was a certain cultural expectation that if you were a good person, you wanted to be a respected politician or a respected business person or a respected housewife, you went to church. That was a cultural expectation. And questions about which denomination were secondary to that. The expectation was that that's where you went. So that's the first part of our cultural context over the last 60 years or so. Alongside that, there were not all of the social options in terms of socializing options that we have available today. People weren't able to go out. There weren't the plethora of cafes and clubs, and people weren't as wealthy often. So churches provided a really important social foundation in communities as well. So there was the way of garnering respect. And then there was the practical, this was where I might meet my partner, or this is where my friends all hang out as well. And the church and state were quite interwoven, not so much in our end of the Reformation. We're obviously not a state church, but still an expectation that government should be listening to churches. You know, churches much more at the centre of society, and with a voice that was expected to be not necessarily agreed with at all times, but certainly respected and listened to. In the last couple of decades, all of that has changed dramatically. And I like to try and think about this perhaps as what was compulsory voting. Like you had to go to church to be respectable. That was where you met your partner. That was where you made social connections. Compulsory voting became voluntary in the last few decades. And even more than that, now, and this may be your experience, I think it's certainly been mine at different times, when people find out you're a Christian, they're more likely to go, oh, literally take a step back. So instead of going to church garnering respect, it's much more likely to garner on a sliding scale from dubious humour to complete disrespect or lack of trust. So that's a pretty big flip in a very short amount of time. And as well as that, obviously the church is not perceived anymore as the purity police or the purveyor of respectability. So what I find fascinating in that context is that people still go to church. I don't find it curious that people don't go to church, because I suspect, and maybe this is me being cynical, but I suspect many of those people who were going in the post-war years were not there because they wanted to get to know Jesus or be a disciple or love God. But I'm not wanting to make huge statements, but there are a whole lot of other reasons to go: habit, cultural expectation, social connection, and so on. Now, all of those things are stripped away. You could do much more socially engaging things on a Sunday morning. Sleep in, go for brunch, see friends, play sport, etc. It's not a way of garnering respect. The church is often ridiculed, and for good reason in lots of places. The church has acted in vile ways. And whilst I think the Uniting Church has acted in less vile ways, we're not innocent. Like, there are still things that the church has done across that has hurt so many people. And yet people choose to turn up on a Sunday morning or a Sunday evening. And I suspect that in fact there might be more people attending worship, in the sense that they're not going for social kudos, for connection, out of habit, out of expectation. They're going because they actually are yearning for more for other. They might put that in different words: yearning for the divine, wondering about greater meaning in life, lover of Jesus, wanting to understand the biblical text, a whole range of things. But it's much more likely to be for those reasons than out of habit or out of gaining respect. So I think that's the first thing in the book that I talk about. And as you can see from the title, it's the church triumphant, but the triumphant is crossed out. And then underneath is written as salt. Because what I find really fascinating, if you go to the Gospels, I don't recall, and maybe you guys can help me see it if I'm missing it, I don't recall anywhere where Jesus says, be at the centre of society telling everyone else what to do. Be the church and gain social respectability. Be the church and build tennis courts. Like, it's so contrasting to what Jesus talks about in the Gospels that the church is supposed to be about. So what I think this time gives us, while it's painful, it's really hard for our egos and for our kind of concept of the world, this time in history is giving us this really rich opportunity to go back to the question, what are we here for? What are we here for as a church? And what do we need to let die? And what is the life that we're being called into? And to stay really centrally with that question, and then let all the other questions flow out of those questions. What are we here for? So when I began the work, I assumed that the metaphor, because I wanted to use biblical metaphors, I assumed that salt would be one of a few. That there'd also be chapters on being the mustard seed, just little, or being like a little child, which Jesus calls people to be like, or even reflections on the parable of the woman and the lost coin, and those kind of things. But the more I dived into the metaphor of salt and continued to write the chapters, I realised, oh no, we just need to stay with salt. So today, what time did we start? 3:10 or? Great, okay, cool. Today, we're not going to go in depth into all of the chapters, but I'd love to explore just a little bit with you the first main chapter. If you can imagine in your hand some salt, one of the striking features about salt is it is little. It's really little. And it's a curious substance too, like it's not a spice or a herb, it's this in-between thing of its own, but it's very little. So I just want to read you the bit where Jesus talks about salt in Matthew, and I'll read you the whole, like it's got a section that it comes with. So it's Sermon on the Mount. This is the first big thing that Jesus does in Matthew's Gospel. It does, and I'll just read you some of the words he says because they're still pretty shocking. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs. So think of the Roman Empire, think of centurions standing around this crowd, pretty aggressively, I would imagine in some cases. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, Jesus goes on to talk about light. You're the light on the hill. Now, we love that as a church, don't we? A lot of stained glass windows about light and hymns, we're the light, be the light, share the light. Not so many about salt. I think it's been a bit too humble for us for a long, long time. Little stained glass images of salt everywhere. So I'd like to invite us to stay with this littleness a little bit longer, because I think what has happened in our culture is that we have mixed up success and faithfulness. Sorry, the COVID cough. I'm not allergic anymore. I'm out of ISO. Our culture constantly tells us, and it's in politics, it's in advertising, and everywhere we go, big means better, constantly. And it's almost impossible, I think, in our culture as Christians not to get slumped into that. It's really hard not to think that faithful means how many people turned up today? How many programs do you offer? How many people have you got doing this? Like, we are so culturally saturated in this notion that to be successful, and for us, hopefully faithful gets in there somewhere, is to be big. And I think that liberating ourselves from that at this particular cultural time is incredibly important. I'm not saying that big is unfaithful, but we need to separate the two. So in the book, I introduce us to someone who I cherish very much, is Justin Martyr. Justin was writing, he's a fascinating guy. So born in 100, John's Gospel might not have been written yet. People debate whether it was written in the 90s or maybe 110 up to 120. Non-Jewish guy, really interested in philosophy, follows a whole lot of philosophical schools around, becomes curious about Christians who don't renege when they're being thrown in the arena, for example, attacked by others, lions coming at them. Ends up becoming a Christian, and he's a really educated guy, and he writes these letters, which we still have access to, which is super exciting. So there's one to the emperor saying, could you just give Christians a bit of a break, please? And then one to a Jewish arguing partner. We don't know if it's a real person or if it's an imagined person, but he's trying to explain how Jewish sacred texts reveal that Jesus is the God one. So they're super fascinating. Now, what I love about him as a friend for us in this period is the church is not at the centre of society. There are no buildings yet. I don't think that there are tight structures yet, like bishops are, I mean, there might be bishops, but they're more like local ministers. There's not hierarchical structures yet. And it's pretty hard. Life is hard. Christians, if some of you may know this already, have a reputation for being atheists. Do you know this? Because they refuse to take food offerings to all the local Greco-Roman gods. And they're seen as a kind of really annoying threat. Like, if you've been brought up in a context where you've got to take the food offerings so that there's not an earthquake, so that we get a good crop, so that we have a child, and these bloody Christians won't do it, they're doing civil disobedience. And the risk of them bringing calamity is a feared thing. Now, whether everyone believes it or not, don't know, but that was certainly the cultural expectation. So they're atheists who won't toe the line, won't be respectable and do the right thing. So they're kind of viewed similarly in some ways to us, though I don't think, we can't claim to be persecuted. I think if we were in Iran or in parts of Indonesia, we could say that we actually are. I don't think in Australia it's fair to say that Christians are persecuted, but we're certainly viewed suspiciously in lots of contexts. So there's a point of similarity. And when he writes, he talks, I'll just read you a little bit directly of him because he's so fresh. So this is his letter in the first apology to the emperor. Thus, we're even called atheists. We do proclaim ourselves atheists as regards those whom you call gods, but not with respect to the most true God, who is alien to all evil and is the father of justice, temperance, and other virtues. We do not worship with many sacrifices and floral offerings, the things human have made, set in temples and called gods. This we think is not only stupid, but also disrespectful to God, who is ineffably glory and form. And then just to get a flavour of how much Christians aren't liked in their cultural context, lest anyone should say to us, all of you go kill yourselves and thus go immediately to God and save us the trouble, I will explain why we do not do that. So this is the expectation. So Justin doesn't have any assumption that being faithful or successful is about being liked by those in power or by those around you. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that as well. That is not the measure of faithfulness or success, whether we attracting huge numbers or whether we are liked by the authorities or by our neighbours. Instead, he talks about what he believes is core. And friends, I think this is so profound for us as well. He talks about people starting to live in love. So he uses male language for God. He also calls Jesus Sophia, by the way, in other areas. So, he calls Jesus Sophia, woman wisdom, explicitly in his other letter. But here he says, the Heavenly Father wishes the repentance of a sinner rather than punishment. Concerning the love we should have for all, Christ thus taught, if you love those who love you, what new thing do you do? For even the fornicators do this. But I say unto you, pray for your enemies, love them that hate you, bless them that curse you, and pray for those who insult you. You can see it's deeply grounded in the Sermon on the Mount here, which might be like 10 years old when he's born, if Matthew's written in the 90s. He taught us to share our goods with the needy and do nothing for our own personal glory. When he said to give everyone who asks of you, and do not turn your back on anyone who would borrow, for if you lend to them who you hope will repay you, what new things do you do? And be kind and merciful, as your heavenly Father also is kind and merciful, who makes his sun rise on the sinners and on the just and the wicked. So this is what he sees as core, regardless of how many people turn up on a Sunday, regardless of what the authorities think of them. This is what success, what faithfulness is about. And then he talks about what happens when people do that. And remember, people meet for worship on a Sunday, usually after work. Sundays are working days. So they're not meeting, well, I get the impression they're not meeting heaps of times for Bible studies during the week. And they're all just trying to survive in the Roman Empire with a whole lot of hostilities and just normal, very high mortality rates and poverty and all the other stuff going on. So they seek to live in this love. We can show that this happened in the case of many of those who are of your side, so from the Greco-Roman context, and turned from a life of violence and tyranny because they were conquered either by the constancy of their neighbours' lives or by the strange patience they noted in their injured associates, or by experiencing their honesty in business matters. So what he's saying is that people noticed a difference in the way in which Christians were living out their day-to-day life, to the extent that it made them want to go and explore Christian faith. Let's just let that land a little bit. He talks about worship as well, and I just want to share this with you because it is pretty cool. On the day that is called Sunday, we have a common assembly of all who live in the cities or in their outlying districts, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, as long as there is time. Then, when the reader has finished, the president of the assembly verbally admonishes and invites all to imitate such examples of virtue. Then we all stand up together and offer up our prayers. And as we said before, after we finish our prayers, bread and wine and water are presented. There were rumours that they're having cannibalistic feasts. So he's really wanting to make clear it's bread and wine and water. It's not blood and bodies that we're eating. Then I love this line. The one who presides likewise offers up prayers and thanksgiving to the best of their ability. And the people express their approval by saying amen. Pretty humble, not big buildings, not big hierarchies, not set liturgies. The person leads the prayers to the best of their abilities, which I think lets us know often maybe it's not great. There's a little bit of a clue. But this is what's core. I wonder what would happen for us as a church if we stopped valuing our success or faithfulness or importance by the number of people who arrive, or the largeness of the programs we offer, or the buildings we have, or the influence that we have. What kind of energy would we regain if we were able to go, oh, we're called to be salt, not triumphant. It's okay to be little. And hey, guess what happens if you have too much salt? ruins everything. You know, what might it be to be salty communities? The chapters that go on from there, I'll just outline them for you. There is incredibly stunning artwork in each chapter. By the way, this is one of the first ones. A Melbourne artist, Pearl Taylor, made art in response to each chapter, which was an extraordinary experience, actually, because you don't know what an artist might make in response to your work. And she sent this first one, and I was utterly blown away. You can see the salt shaker and then the shadow of the church. And then she made artwork in response to each of the chapters. And I might be able to hold up just a small image of each of them as I introduce it, just to give you a taste. A taste. This is the littleness one, and you can see it's just people at a table. And there's a little gap. So there's room for more. Shifting our thinking again. Another aspect of salt, which you, I don't know when the last time you experienced was, is tears. We weep salty tears. You can see the hands holding the incredible river of tears in this image. I think there is such a gift for us to offer the wider world if we took seriously the place of tears, of lament, in a culture which is obsessed with be positive, live your best life. And in many churches where there is a constant refrain of praise God, but you can't be sad as well. You know, to be sad or to be dealing with mental illness is somehow sinful rather than reality. And in this chapter, I talk quite a lot about the Psalms as a guide for us. I mean, wrap your heart around some of the Psalms and let them speak for you, you know. I've drenched my pillow in tears, God, where are you? My God, why have you forsaken me? Like, these are ancient prayers that give us permission to name our grief, knowing that is not being unfaithful or weak or failing, but it is part of the human condition. And if you've been reading, the lectionary cycle's been dipping into Revelation the last few weeks, and this striking sentence occurs, like, you know, all this full-on imagery of the throne and the Lamb and, you know, all the things. And then there's this refrain, and God will wipe away every tear. Like this notion of the God of the universe caring individually for us and longing to wipe away our tears. I mean, it's a pretty astonishing message to maybe even trust ourselves, let alone share with others. So there's much more, but that's just a taste. The next chapter is dark, salty wombs, because they are where we all grow. And I think this is a really important part of this metaphor of salt, because I'm not suggesting that we just stay little and then die. What I'm inviting us into is to reclaim our early church kind of foundations, but be open to the kind of growth that I think God calls us into. And I don't think it's an accident that Jesus uses metaphors like be born again, so that using this female imagery for God. And it occurs in other places in the biblical text as well, like 1 Peter, this notion that we're called to growth, but for anyone who's tried to have a baby or had a baby, you know that it's vulnerable growth. You can't control it. You cannot plan it like you would plan the growth of a city or the building of a new high-rise. It's much more vulnerable, and you can help, certainly by eating certain things and so on, but you can't create the destiny of it. It's more vulnerable than that. And I think that's much more like the growth that we're called into as people of faith. We're called to grow as individuals, but we're also called to grow as communities of faith. This morning at church, we were talking about Reconciliation Sunday and the covenant between First Nations and Second Nations. I mean, that's a beautiful example of ongoing hard work growth in the uniting church. It's not been automatic. You know, the First Nations aren't mentioned in the first drafts of the basis of union. And then the preamble comes along, and then there's the renewal of the covenant. That's growth, hard work, vulnerable growth. It also, this chapter talks about the way in which the biblical text is misread to, for example, create hate against people in the LGBTQI community, that marriage and birth are not straightforward in the biblical text. Now, the next chapter is possibly the most obvious when we think about salt that preserves. But I push quite hard in this chapter, and each of the chapters I engage with uniting church people who engaged in ministry, and all from this synod, actually, from Melbourne and for a little bit from rural. Not all, yeah, from different presbyteries, but from this synod. And one of the stories I tell, first let me unpack. So this can be a tricky one. People can say, oh, we have to preserve the truth or preserve whatever, preserve the tradition. Well, I would always want to come back to what truth, which tradition. Because in some places, people think that organs, blessings on the organ, are a tradition. They're not that old, actually. A couple of 100 years, sure, but they're not the tradition. Or that pews are the tradition. Or even women in ordination, the tradition. If we go back to the biblical text, there's examples of women leaders. So when we say we want to preserve, we need to be careful about what we're seeking to preserve and whose agenda is running, and have the hard conversations about that. In the book, I talk about a young woman who spoke at Synod a couple of years ago, and she was asked to talk about what young people want in the church. And she got up and she was pretty dry, and she said, we're not a species, and I don't represent all young people. But then she said these words, I want to know Jesus. We want to know Jesus. And for my money's worth, I think that's the core of what we're called to preserve. I don't mean know as in memorize biblical verses. I'm talking about knowing both intellectually, like bringing the big questions, doing the really exciting discovery about how Mark contradicts John and Matthew and Luke, like diving deeply and helping people, equipping people to be able to wrestle with that. But I also mean, what on earth does it mean to pray? And I feel like we've really failed at that in the church. If people grew up in the church, they might have gone to Sunday school or picked up in church, basically a form of prayer that I like to call the shopping list of doom. You know, the one? Dear God, fix Ukraine, help the police in America to get better at gun violence, responding to gun violence. This, amen. With no sense that God's not actually going to do anything, wondering why we're going through the motions, like just this shopping list of doom. It's not nourishing, it's not meeting true needs, it doesn't create space for the questions. I think to engage seriously with prayer means going way back to the traditions, like to the mothers and fathers in the deserts, and right through the tradition, and drawing deeply from my own perspective, contemplative traditions is where I come from. But helping people to know that there's not one way to pray, there's not one way to believe, but to give people spaces and opportunities to learn and dive deeply into what knowing Jesus might be. Because friends, this is my view, and you might want to come back at me. I think this is the only thing that we can uniquely offer the wider community. There are awesome community groups doing awesome work. There are awesome social justice groups doing great work. And there are great interreligious conversation type things, but the one thing that we can offer as a church is space to engage with the story of the God who comes to us in Jesus, and how we might relate to that God, who is. I don't mean that we then stop doing food centres or social justice, but there are lots of places doing that. This is the one thing that we're uniquely placed. And I would push that further. I think in the Uniting Church, we're even more uniquely placed because we're really clear that we don't believe the Bible is the word of God. In the basis of union, our foundation document, the Bible is unique, prophetic, apostolic, so pointing to the records of people's experience of the risen Jesus, but Jesus is the Word, the living Word. So we're offering people genuine space to come in with all of the questions, say, that is awesome. Let's talk. The final big chapter is seasoning. You can see the soup here. And there's lots of buildings and people in here. And there's this astonishing verse. Each of the chapters, as well as engaging with contemporary expressions of ministry, engages with people like Justin and Origen and different early church writers who have so much wisdom to offer us. But I was astonished to realise, I don't think I'd ever noticed before, that in Colossians there's this line about season all your conversations with salt by speaking graciously. How many times we failed at that today? Like the call to speak graciously, and the author's talking about like when you're out and about, as particularly, as a call. Can we imagine that? That we're actually called to not be the meat or the tofu, depending on your food preference, but it's already out there, but we're called to season, to bring out the flavour, to bring out the good, to bring out the conversation around mercy and justice and truth, like hard truths and so on. That's part of who we're called to be individually and together. I mean, that is just mind-blowing, I think. So rather than us spending our time worrying about what other people think of us and why people aren't coming and why we're not respected in the same way, I think this particular time in history invites us to come back to the question, what are we here for? The final chapter is a very short one, just summarising it all. And you can see the person working in the paddock or the veggie patch, and they're a bit sweaty. Because it is going to be hard work to change. Really hard work shifting away from our own ego agendas. And even more so, I wrote this during the first lockdown, but I thought when I finished it, I hope it's still relevant because we're not in lockdown anymore. Well, it came out in lockdown and it was lockdown still. So the questions that we thought were a bit novel in that first, 6 months of the first lockdown are not novel. They're still here, like as people choose whether they come back to church or not, and how communities engage again. Like these are really pertinent questions for all of us, I think. So coming back to some of the stuff that it's recorded that Jesus says, I think helps us to notice when we're being schlepped into the cultural narratives and when we need to break free from those. I think that's enough for now, and then we can take questions. How does that sound? Oh, it's before we go, could I offer you guys a prayer? This is the prayer at the end of the littleness chapter. Jesus, bright morning star, you say we are salt, the salt of the earth. Forgive us when we would rather be an army. Set us free from our longings for crowds and castles. Tear down our walls and tear up our to-do lists. Help us to let you hold us so that we can uncoil. Help us to relax into our smallness and trust in your vastness so that together we may become pockets of compassion as you call us to be. Amen.
Thank you, Sally. We're deeply in your debt for coming today to talk to us virtually and physically. And I'm sure that what you've said is going to keep people thinking for a long time. We still have two copies of the book left to sale. And anybody out, any of the Zoomers who would like a copy, if you send an email to the PCNV address, which you'll find on the website, we'll be able to procure them for you and have it posted to you. So that's good. And as a token of our esteem, a little something that's it's ephemeral, unfortunately. But I hope you do enjoy it, and when you do, remember us. And and let me assure you, you're always welcome back here. When you write your next book, I'm sure we'll have you back.
Thank you.